In the quiet countryside of rural Kentucky, where neighbors still waved from porches and church bells rang every Sunday morning, life moved slowly. For most people in the small town of Cedar Creek, the days blurred together in a peaceful, predictable rhythm. But for 17-year-old Mason Clark, life felt anything but peaceful. After losing his father in a tragic car crash 2 years earlier, Mason had become withdrawn, drifting through life like a ghost. He rarely spoke at school, avoided gatherings, and spent most of his free time walking the long, winding roads on the outskirts of town, lost in his thoughts. His mother, overwhelmed with grief and working double shifts to make ends meet, struggled to connect with him. Mason found more comfort in solitude than in the company of his classmates, or even his own family. It was during one of these lonely walks that he first saw the house, an old Victorian structure with peeling white paint, ivy crawling up the sides, and a sagging porch swing that creaked in the wind. The house belonged to Margaret Holloway, a 71-year-old widow who had lived there for decades. Margaret was something of a mystery in Cedar Creek. She had once worked as the town's librarian, known for her strict rules and love for poetry. But after her husband died of a heart attack 10 years ago, she rarely left her home. Most locals considered her a recluse. Some whispered that she was strange, maybe even a little unhinged, but no one ever accused her of being unkind. Mason's first encounter with Margaret was accidental. He had paused in front of her house to tie his shoelace when the front door creaked open. She called out to him, asking if he'd be willing to help carry some boxes from her attic. With nothing else to do, and perhaps craving the smallest bit of attention, Mason agreed. That simple task led to more visits. At first, it was small things, sweeping the porch, trimming the hedges, helping with groceries. She'd offer him iced tea afterward, and they'd sit quietly on the porch swing, watching the wind dance through the trees. As the weeks passed, their interactions grew longer and more personal. Margaret seemed fascinated by Mason, asking questions about his life, his dreams, his pain. For the first time in years, Mason felt heard. Margaret, too, appeared to come alive in his presence. She laughed more, dressed better, and even began baking again. It wasn't long before Mason started skipping school just to spend more time at her house. He would read her old novels aloud or help her sort through dusty photo albums from the 1960s. Their connection, though unusual, felt natural to them. They were two broken souls who had found comfort in each other's presence. But beneath the surface, something unspoken was growing, something that neither of them would fully admit, something far beyond friendship. And in the quiet corners of that aging house, a dark bond was taking shape, one that would soon pull them into a storm no one could have predicted. As the months passed, Mason's visits to Margaret's house became a regular part of his routine. He stopped hanging out with his friends, stopped going to the few social events that still existed in Cedar Creek. Instead, he found solace in the company of the elderly woman who seemed to understand him in a way no one else did. Margaret's house, with its creaking floors and dusty windows, became his refuge. And in return for his time, she offered him comfort, attention, and things he never thought he would have, things that filled the emptiness inside him. Margaret, for her part, found herself growing attached to Mason. He was young, vibrant, and willing to listen, something her late husband had never been able to do in their later years together. She started to look forward to his visits more than she would admit, and as the days turned into weeks, she began giving him small gifts. It started innocently enough, a vintage pocket watch she had inherited from her father, a scarf she had knitted herself, a hand-carved pen she'd found at an estate sale. But the gifts soon became more lavish. Mason didn't know how to react when Margaret handed him a designer leather jacket one rainy afternoon. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure if he should accept it. It wasn't like anything he had ever owned before, but the smile on her face made it hard to refuse. Margaret told him it was something she had been saving for a special occasion, and she seemed so pleased to see him wearing it that Mason felt a strange sense of guilt lifting from his shoulders. There was something about her generosity that felt both comforting and unsettling. He wasn't used to receiving so much. She started slipping money into his pockets too. Small sums at first, then larger amounts. Cash for new shoes, for a night out at the local diner. At first he refused, but Margaret insisted, saying it was the least she could do for all the help he had given her. Over time, the money became a regular part of their exchanges. It wasn't just the things she gave him that kept him coming back, though. It was the sense of validation he felt in her presence, the warmth of her affection that made him forget about his lonely life at home. Mason's friends began to notice his growing detachment. His old circle of classmates who once joked around with him after school started questioning his behavior. Why was he always with that strange old woman? Why wasn't he coming to the parties or hanging out at the park like everyone else? Mason didn't have an answer. It was as if he had stepped into another world, one where no one judged him, where the pain of his past faded into the background. The more people questioned him, the more he felt the need to retreat further into Margaret's world. But as the friendship deepened, so did the whispers in town. Some of the older folks started raising their eyebrows when they saw Mason coming and going from Margaret's house at odd hours. Their judgment was masked with polite smiles, but the gossip was impossible to ignore. It was just a matter of time before the whispers reached the wrong ears. Mason's mother, who had started to grow concerned about his increasing absences and the odd gifts he brought home. She had caught him with the designer jacket once, and, when she asked where it had come from, he had brushed her off with an unconvincing lie. But deep down, Mason knew there was something wrong, something he couldn't explain even to himself. He found himself thinking about Margaret more than he should. At night, when he was alone in his room, he would replay the moments they had shared, the touch of her hand on his arm, the way her eyes would light up when they spoke. He didn't understand the feelings that were stirring inside him. All he knew was that he had never felt more alive, more seen than he did when he was with her. But somewhere beneath the surface, that connection was becoming something darker, something he wasn't yet ready to admit. It was only a matter of time before the boundaries of their relationship would no longer remain clear, and when that moment came, it would change everything. The lines between affection and obsession began to blur. As the days turned into weeks, Mason's obsession with Margaret deepened. At first, it was easy to ignore the uncomfortable thoughts that crept into his mind, the ones that hinted at something, more than just friendship between them. But as Margaret continued to shower him with gifts and attention, those thoughts began to consume him. He found himself increasingly isolated from his peers, no longer feeling like part of the world outside her house. The more he withdrew, the more he depended on her. Margaret seemed to sense the change in him too. Her attention became even more intense. She would often call him late at night, asking if he needed anything, offering to cook him dinner or simply chat. Mason felt a strange mix of desire and guilt. He was drawn to her warmth, to the affection she lavished upon him, but at the same time, he knew it wasn't right. She was old enough to be his grandmother, and yet he couldn't stop thinking about her. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that it was just the loneliness, the grief he had been carrying since his father died. But deep down, he understood that this wasn't a simple connection. It was something much more complicated. Margaret, too, began to grow more possessive. She started making demands on his time, insisting that he visit her more often, even though she knew he had other responsibilities. She would ask him to skip school, to stay with her when he was supposed to be out with his friends. Mason complied, without hesitation, secretly thrilled by the attention, but also feeling trapped by it. The power she seemed to have over him unsettled him, but he couldn't break free. His sense of right and wrong had become clouded in the haze of her affection. One afternoon, as the weather grew warmer, Mason arrived at Margaret's house to find her waiting for him on the porch, a small package in her hands. She smiled and handed it to him, telling him it was a gift for his birthday. Mason was taken aback. He hadn't mentioned his birthday to her. How could she have known? But he didn't ask questions. Instead, he tore open the wrapping paper, revealing a large sum of money. Margaret explained that it was for him to use however he wanted, but Mason couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a generous gift. It was a way of binding him to her. Mason's discomfort grew as Margaret became more insistent about their future together. She would talk about moving away, the two of them leaving Cedar Creek behind. She spoke of a life where they could escape the judgment of others, where no one would look at them the way the town did. Margaret spoke of running away to a new life, one where they would be free from the constraints of society, free to be together without shame. At first, Mason brushed off her ideas as fantasies, but over time they began to take root in his mind. He started to believe that maybe they could start fresh, leave everything behind, and live a life that no one could judge. In the quiet moments they shared, Mason couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement at the idea of escaping with Margaret. He had always felt like an outsider, and the thought of leaving his old life behind, of being with her in a new place, where no one would understand the connection they had, felt both thrilling and dangerous. The guilt he had once felt was fading, replaced by an overwhelming desire to be with her. But the more Mason thought about it, the more he realized that their relationship had shifted into something darker, something he was no longer sure how to control. One evening, as Mason stood outside Margaret's house, looking at the dim light in her window, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Could he really run away with her? Could he leave behind everything, his friends, his family, his future, for this? The thought lingered in his mind as he knocked on her door, a knot of tension tightening in his stomach. What had started as a friendship had grown into something far more dangerous, and now there was no turning back. As the weeks wore on, Mason's life became a careful balancing act. On the outside, he continued to go through the motions, attending school, helping his mother with chores, and pretending to be the same teenager he once was. But inside, everything had changed. His thoughts were consumed with Margaret and the future they had started to plan together. The secrecy of their relationship had deepened the bond between them, and the isolation from the outside world made him feel even more trapped. He knew he was living a lie, but the weight of that lie was something he had grown used to. The more he withdrew from his family and friends, the more attached he became to Margaret. But as he grew closer to her, things began to spiral in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Mason's mother, already suspicious of his increasingly erratic behavior, noticed the strange gifts he had begun receiving, designer clothes, money, and things he had never been able to afford before. She questioned him once, but Mason had brushed her off with a vague excuse. However, her concern continued to mount. One evening she found a letter from Margaret tucked under his bed, a letter that revealed far more than she was prepared to face. It was clear to her now that the two of them were involved in something deeply inappropriate, something that crossed a line she couldn't ignore. She confronted Mason the next day. Her voice was trembling with a mix of fear and anger. She demanded to know what was going on between him and Margaret. Mason tried to deny it, tried to reassure her that everything was fine, but his mind raced. He didn't know how to explain his feelings for Margaret without sounding like a fool. So instead of lying outright, he simply remained silent, unable to defend himself against the truth that was now undeniable. The more his mother pushed, the more his anxiety grew. He knew in that moment that the fragile world he had built around himself was crumbling. Margaret had warned him about the consequences of anyone finding out, but Mason had never imagined that his mother would figure it out. The fear of being exposed began to gnaw at him. Margaret, too, had become increasingly paranoid. She spoke often of running away, of leaving everything behind to start a new life in some faraway place where no one would ever judge them. But Mason wasn't ready for that. He still couldn't bring himself to cut all ties to his family, to everything he had ever known. Despite his growing feelings for Margaret, the reality of what she was asking him to do, of what they were becoming, began to sink in. Then, one night, Margaret called him in a panic. She was frantic, telling him that she couldn't stand the pressure any longer. Someone had seen them together, and the rumors were starting to spread. She insisted that they needed to leave, now. She told Mason that it was their only option, if they were to avoid ruining both of their lives. But Mason was torn. The gravity of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had spent so much time dreaming of a future with her, imagining a life free from the judgment of others. But now that it was becoming a reality, he felt paralyzed. The next day, Margaret withdrew a large sum of money from her bank account, much more than she had ever given him before. She handed him an envelope, telling him it was for their escape, for their new life. But this time, it wasn't just money. There was a chilling sense of finality in her actions, a feeling that something irreversible was about to happen. The gift felt different, more like a bribe to keep him locked in this twisted world they had created together. Mason stood at the crossroads, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The idea of running away with Margaret seemed like an escape from everything that had hurt him in the past, but he also knew that it was a path that would destroy everything he had left behind. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his stomach, the growing sense that whatever he chose, he would lose himself in the process. And with each passing moment, the decision weighed heavier on him, until it felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to take a leap into the unknown. The morning of the decision came faster than Mason had anticipated. He woke up to the harsh light streaming through his bedroom window, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. The envelope with the money was still sitting on his nightstand, and Margaret's words echoed in his head. "We need to leave now before it's too late." She had seemed so sure, so certain that running away was their only option. Mason knew deep down that he could never go back to the life he had before Margaret. His mother's questioning, his friend's suspicion, it all seemed so distant now, like a life he had left behind long ago. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had lost in the process. The world he had built with Margaret had isolated him from everything that once mattered, and now he was standing on the edge, staring into an abyss that promised no return. He dressed quickly, almost mechanically, and left the house before his Mother could say another word. She had been gone at work all morning, and this would be his only chance to leave without confrontation. He didn't know when or if he would return, but the need to escape, to break free from the suffocating grip of his own life, pushed him forward. As he walked to Margaret's house, his heart beat loudly in his chest, each step heavier than the last. The familiar house loomed in front of him, its ivy-covered facade now a reminder of how far he had gone down this dark path. The door opened before he even knocked, and Margaret stood in the doorway, her face filled with a mix of anticipation and fear. She had been waiting for him, and the moment he stepped inside, he felt a sense of finality. She led him to the living room where a bag was already packed with clothes, food, and essentials. Margaret didn't waste time. She was ready. But Mason hesitated, his hand resting on the strap of his own bag, unsure whether he could take that last step. The money, the plan, it all seemed so real now, and yet the doubt was there, growing, stronger with every passing second. Margaret sat down beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. She looked at him with eyes full of understanding, but Mason could see the flicker of desperation beneath the surface. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "The town will never accept us. They'll never understand. But we can have something no one else can. Just you and me. Don't you want that?" He wanted to believe her. He wanted to think that running away was the answer, that they could escape the judgment of the world and create a new life together. But deep inside, Mason knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just the judgment of others that haunted him. It was the sense of something darker, something dangerous, in the air between them. The line they had crossed was impossible to uncross. Just as Mason was about to speak, there was a loud knock at the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. Margaret's face paled, and for the first time, Mason saw fear in her eyes. She rushed to the window and peered outside. "They found us," she said, her voice trembling. Mason felt a wave of panic wash over him. The sirens grew louder, and through the window, he could see flashing lights drawing closer. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the weight of his choices pressing down on him harder than ever. Margaret began pacing, her hands wringing together. "What do we do?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret turned toward him, her eyes wide with panic. She looked like a different person now, no longer the calm, collected woman who had once offered him solace. The desperation in her gaze was unmistakable. "We have to leave now, before they get here. You have to trust me," she pleaded.